When you were starting out, what gave you that steel to be able to compete with other established photographers? Because you were the new kid on the block.
It was much more hierarchical then as well. It was impossible to kind of get work, for the colour supplements, because there was this kind of clique of very well-known, mainly men, who were kind of the dominant photographers. So Clive Arrowsmith or John Swanell, they were sort of the people that would, or David Montgomery, who I assisted actually. They kind of were getting most of the commissions for the Sunday Times, and it was lucky because the Independent launched, and there were two picture editors sort of who ran the desk, Victoria Lukens and Susan Glenn, and they kind of gave me, they were willing to use young people. So what I did was rather than I remember at the time I wasn't really trendy enough to work for, The Face, or I subsequently did get commissions from The Face and ID and stuff like that. I sort of came up to London, my parents were, at that point, we were quite skint, and I went on the Enterprise Allowance Scheme, which was this scheme that Thatcher had, £40 a week, and you could come off the dole. I did a bit of assisting. Like I said, I assisted Lester Bookbinder, who died recently, actually, and he'd worked with my dad, and so he actually got me along on a couple of jobs as an assistant and introduced me to David Montgomery and a couple of other big photographers. But I was a terrible assistant, so I didn't really do that for very long. And simultaneously, I did have, I'd got really into doing portraits while I was at college. I did an OND at college. I didn't, most of my assistants, they're all much more qualified than I am. I didn't do an H&D or anything like that, just did an OND. So barely worth more than an A-level, really. But what happened when I was at college, something clicked and we just discovered Irving Penn and Richard Avedon, and just looking at the pictures in the school light, and Nick Knight as well, and looking at the lighting and everything. And we weren't really meant to use the medium format cameras, the Hasselblads and everything, but they would let us use them. And so I just started aping, basically like David Bailey, with a white light on the white backdrop, and then one directional lighting on the subject, like Bailey's pictures in the 60s. And I just basically started photographing everybody that way, with Agfa, Pan, 100, and, studio lighting. So unlike most people from college, I didn't have a mishmash of different things. It's probably much more focused now. Students that I meet, their work is much more, corralled into a vision. But, at the time I came out of college, people just had a sort of a mishmash, all these different techniques, bar relief or whatever.
Can I jump in there?
Yeah.
Has it become a sort of homogenized the way that young people are looking at the world now through the lens? Has it become dull?
I think it's much more difficult to sort of establish yourself as having kind of any uniqueness.
Right. The fingerprint you talk about, because obviously your work has a fingerprint. You could spot one of your pictures.
Well, probably I'd like to think that, but I do think it's more difficult with digital SLRs because we're all using the same equipment.
Yeah,
and in a way, it's good because it's not about technique. Technique's a given. It's about sort of kind of what are you trying to say? How do you feel about this? Conveying emotion and passion, and that's the first question you should ask yourself with a project is, how do you feel about this? Because that energy was what you're going to need to carry it through. Back then, I was it was hard to get that, to get a negative that you could print that would look like a David Bailey, but I sort of learned how to do it. So when I came up to London, I had a whole portfolio. I photographed all my friends in that style. So I went to see the NME, and they just immediately started giving me these jobs. And I liked Steve Pike. I was sort of looking at Steve Pike's stuff, and he was doing something similar. And so I just immediately, my second job was like Tom Petty, Quentin Tarantino, the Bangles, all these people that were like quite, on paper, quite famous. Yeah, what I would do is I'd go into King's Reach Tower, where the NME was based. When it came out every week, I'd sort of get a bundle of issues, because you could just take them. And then I'd sort of cut them all out, because it was all pre-digital. And I'd just sort of post them to the Independent on Sunday and say, "Hi, Victoria, it was great to see you the other day. Just thought you'd be interested in knowing what I've been doing." And it was like a soft sell, and I sort of just wore them down to the extent that it was gone. I never went to openings or parties or had a social network or anything like that. Back then you had to sort of just go and see someone and then try and kind of wear them down, maybe with the odd little Christmas card or whatever. But it was kind of people forget it was a completely different era. There were no phones. I sort of had a pager at one point, so people would have to phone me, and then their number would appear on the page, and you'd have to phone them back. And then after that, you'd have the most sort of so you'd have to use a payphone to actually phone people back. And then the evolution of the smartphone is kind of.
But I guess it's a bit like the acting world. I guess you're only as good as your last gig.
Yeah.
Are you still only as good as your last gig?
I probably could coast if I want to. But one thing I've observed actually with the likes of Jane Bone or in terms of writing, someone like Lynn Barber, who I work with a lot, she's still as tenacious as ever, and Jane Bone, very, very professional, although she would disarm her subjects by appearing like a kind of like lovely old granny, she was very fiercely kind of professional in terms of her the rigour of her approach.
And I think you talk about I think I picked up something you said, because you regard women as being probably better photographers than men because they have because they're not as assertive, or they don't.
I think a big part of sort of male and female, it's a big part of it's a sort of a construct, and I sort of think in terms of like male traits and sort of female traits, and so obviously we've all got male and female traits, but obviously women tend to have more female traits and vice versa, and so I tend to think I've got quite good female traits in the sense that I kind of quite open and communicative, and so I do think I do think that modern photography is more, if you're the female, the traits that we associate with women are kind of rewarded in modern photography. So you can't have a massive ego and sort of like try and by force of will get your own way. It's much more effective to kind of persuade and cajole and show people that you're sincere and that you're not a hack, and you're emotionally vulnerable. You put yourself out there. You put up an idea that you might get laughed at. But if you're sincere, they'll go along with it. It's a psychological thing as well. I mean, I do tend to favour using women as assistants, just because I think, on balance, if you're photographing a woman, then it's not so intrusive. If you've got two men turning up at their house, it can be a bit intimidating, or the atmosphere wouldn't be quite as good as if it's just a male and a female. And then if you're photographing a man, they tend to be better behaved in front of a woman, in the business world, because I sort of do a monthly sort of portrait for Management Today, so you quite often don't have very much time. You're doing like Francesca and I did the head of Google the other day, and they kind of tend to be better behaved or less. If there's two guys there, there can be a sort of a competitiveness that can kind of engender itself, which is a bit weird.
What are the intrinsic qualities you're looking for in an assistant?
It depends on the job. So, for instance, when I was doing a lot of advertising work, it's important to have somebody who you can collaborate with on lighting. So somebody who's as good at lighting as you are, it's quite useful, because it's quite stressful if you're doing an ad job and you're getting paid quite a lot of money, and you want as big a gang as possible, basically. So I'd have at least 2 or 3 assistants, and then maybe a digital operator as well, and then the main assistant. I used to work with this guy called Sam Christmas, who's now really good, great name, but also really good photographer actually, and he's doing really well now. He does a lot of stuff with motorbikes and stuff like that, which is his passion. But he was really good at lighting, and I'm quite good at lighting, so we would kind of problem solve. But for my editorial jobs, where there isn't a budget anyway to have that kind of level of layers of assistant, I tend to just have people that I just get on really well with, because it's, as I say, about the relationship you have with the person on the day. And if you've got to go, like Francesca and I, we flew up to Westeros in Ullapool. We stayed in Ullapool and we photographed these salmon. It was for this fast food, sort of healthy fast food company called Leon that have all these restaurants, 40 around London. And we were photographing their suppliers. And although I was going to say, I kind of contradicted myself because that's like an advertising shoot, but it was kind of editorial in its nature. And you're spending sort of like a couple of days with someone, so you just want someone that you get on really well with, and who, when you're photographing the subject, is quite cool, and they'll like the person as well. And sometimes, you kind of, for whatever reason, you might sort of stumble a bit and you don't really know what you're saying. I remember photographing Daniel Radcliffe, and my assistant at the time was a guy called Chris Owens, who I'm good friends with all my old assistants, and he was nearer Daniel's age, because he was sort of like about 23, and Daniel I think was probably about 19 at that point. And I suddenly realised I didn't. It was a bit like when I'm talking to my son who's 19. I didn't know what to say. I just, anything I would have said would have sounded patronising. And I got on really. I liked Daniel Radcliffe, and he was really nice. And I photographed Rupert Grint recently, but it was really good because Chris was able to sort of talk about bands, with which bands do you like or whatever. And so it's good so rather than, for the most part, assistants, for me, it's more about maintaining that kind of rapport and that relationship, and people who are kind of not pushy and kind of just easy to get on with and have a bit of a laugh with. And I'm really proud that Chris has got his own magazine up in Newcastle now, and other assistants like Annie Collins and Linda Brownlee, they've all done really well in their own way, and I don't think they've been kind of eclipsed. My approach hasn't sort of like kind of imprinted them onto their practice. They've all got they all do what they do and do it very, very well.
Have you had to deal with a really difficult sitter, or is your ability to make them feel at ease? Does that?
Yeah, I quite often I think I'm a relatively good judge of character, or not in terms of sort of judging them and kind of like making a decision about whether they're good or bad, but in terms of assessing the type of personality that they are, and then kind of not ruffling their feathers. So quite often, I remember photographing Goldie, and I arrived and I was photographing him. He's a drum and bass musician, and the journalist was just leaving, and it was clear it was a terrible atmosphere, and it had gone really, really badly, and they'd had a massive fight and everything. And then within 5 minutes, he's really lovely, and it was interesting because I think I've witnessed, in fact, in my talk, there was I sort of had a video of somebody I was interviewing, photographing David Icke, and I went down to the Isle of Wight to photograph him, and whatever you think about him, you've got to kind of try and get a picture, and it's for Sunday Times. And this writer managed to sort of wind him up to the extent that he basically said, "I've had enough. I'm not doing this." And I managed, it's actually on the camera because I started videoing it because I thought they were going to have a fight, and I thought, well, I'm not going to come away with nothing. I'm going to at least show this to the picture department. And in the end, I managed to sort of like, by sort of sacrificing the writer and sort of saying that, basically in front of the writer, sort of saying, I do think you could have read his book, and you hadn't, I had to do that in order to sort of ensure that I got my picture. But the writer was really pissed off at me because I'd sort of like, he didn't really get what I was doing. But I wasn't going to sort of drive all the way down to the Isle of Wight, go on the ferry, drive across to his house and wait there and then come away with nothing. Mm-hmm. I mean, I remember doing Marianne Faithfull, and she was actually quite sweet, but she was just really, really didn't want to be photographed. Yeah. And I got about 6 frames, on a Hasselblad. It was in Ireland. I'd gone all the way to Ireland, but I still got their 6 frames were there. Yeah. But it's doesn't make for good blood pressure. That
no,
sort
it doesn't.
Of situation.
No. Something I was thinking about the other day is when you take portraits. I don't know about you. I'll ask you the question. I mean, kind of everything becomes a sort of self-portrait. Whoever you're photographing, it kind of there's there's the imprint of the photographer on the actual sit. I don't know whether that's
that's what Oscar Wilde said, didn't he? You know, every good portrait is a portrait of the artist rather than the sitter, and that's certainly true. Like of my sister, you know, she's a great portrait painter, and she would say she was a painter, not a portrait painter, but her work is really, they're portraits of me or my dad or my mum or whoever, her friends, but they're really kind of portraits of her, because everything is authored, isn't it? So,
it is authored, yes.
Yeah. I was asked by this website called myoldman.org to take a photograph of my dad for use in this kind of collection of odes to people's fathers, and it's all writers. I was the only person who's a photographer, and I realised the photograph I took of my dad was quite sentimental and not really very representative, and so I sort of actually wrote a piece about my dad, which was quite a hard piece. I mean, do you want me to just quickly read it to you?
Yeah.
You know, my dad worked in advertising. You know, he worked with Irving Penn and people like that. My dad's sort of Jewish American.
Yeah.
He worked in New York on Madison Avenue. You know, he was in the Marines. He joined the American Marines in order to fight Hitler, and then came out of the army and worked in advertising. And he was one of those madmen, you know, one of those kind of crazy guys. And so he had this kind of authority where art and creativity was concerned. And yet he kind of was very dismissive of, like he said to me, you know, I've worked with great photographers, you'll never be a photographer, you know, work in a camera shop. And my sister, you know, who is a great painter, you know, who
did the piece of
that's right. And she was, this year, she's in the BP Portrait Award. She's been shortlisted twice before. My brother's, you know, went to the Royal College of Art, you know, really talented painter, you know, and he dismissed us all in his own way. And so after all this kind of negativity and kind of, which probably says more about him than us, I sort of wrote this piece and then didn't hope that he would never see it, because I thought it's going to be put on this obscure website. I'm just going to kind of keep my head down. And my mum thought it was kind of quite hard, but okay. And my brother, who likes to sort of cause trouble, found the website and sort of immediately told my dad. And I can still remember I was photographing somebody at UCL, a writer, I can't remember his name, but anyway, he was a former alumni of UCL in London, and so I was on the steps of the Slade, sort of on the campus, and you know how when you have a phone call, it's quite often tied to a specific place, and I saw it was my parents' number, and it was my dad, and so I picked up the phone. I can sort of remember this scene really quickly, and he said, I saw what you wrote, and I thought, oh Christ, and my heart was beating. And then he said, I had no idea you were such a good writer. Which was kind of like, after all this kind of negativity about things that I really want his approval for, you know, he acknowledged that I was and also in the book, actually, I write, and I don't know if you've seen the book, the intro, I wrote, and he thought that was well written. So yeah, I'll read it to you. It says, "Why they still hate Jews. That was my father's response to my proposal that we visit his homeland. He was born in New York in the 1920s. His parents came from the East, hoping to find a better life in America. His father, Harry, came from Ukraine, his mother Lillian from Romania. A small, only child, the product of generations hardened by random and spontaneous violence. He lied about his age and joined the Marines in order, he says, to fight Hitler. He once told me, his eyes sparkling, of the time his father, with whom he used to spar, lost his temper and beat him up pretty bad. In the 60s he became an ad man on Madison Avenue, a genuine madman. The lure of a new agency prompted a move to London. Advertising is a chaotic, capricious industry. Now 40 and with a young family, he wanted certainty. In the 70s, my parents sold their house in Fulham and bought a pig farm in Devon. Not the suburban folly of Tom and Barbara Good, but an ugly concrete mass of buildings on a cold north-facing hill. The final job of the day was forking the shit we'd shoveled to the top of a steaming dung heap the size of a bungalow. Cleaning and feeding the pigs was all-consuming. A solitary week at the Atlantic Hotel in Newquay, the only family holiday I remember. In the 90s, the stink and echo of squealing pigs went. The breeze-block buildings were knocked down. Mum and Dad retired. The farm became a relaxing place but full of memories. My dad watches TV and rues missed opportunities. When I became a father, my dad's lack of interest in my children reminded me of what I missed growing up. But you only have one dad, and I love him. So, it wasn't actually too harsh, I don't think. I do think that if you grow up in a very functional, loving environment, quite often it's not as effective a way of producing a child that has resilience. And so because we were kind of left to get on with our own stuff and, for want of a better way, kind of not encouraged or even put down, you can kind of either get beaten by that, or you can kind of you can finesse your way through, or you develop a kind of mental toughness that sort of stands you in good stead, a kind of stoicism. So I probably did develop that, through working on the farm every day, and certainly physical toughness, from when you're a teenager and you're working on a farm.
Probably you could equate then to one of the people you photographed for the Survivor book, the guy who hid in a pigsty.
Interestingly, it's interesting you should pick that one, because if you were, there's I photographed nearly 200 people, so I was thinking, as you were saying that, I was thinking I'm probably not going to necessarily
Jack
Jaggett, he, in fact, lovely that you picked him, because sadly he's actually got a bit of dementia now, but he's a great guy, and funnily enough reminded me a bit of my dad. Had this kind of irascible sort of kind of Norman Mailer kind of macho Woody Allen kind of humour, and lives in Herzliya, which is a really beautiful part of Israel. And we actually went, and my daughter and I went back last summer, and we stayed with Jack and his wife Varda. And as I said, his memory's going, but he's still got that kind of irascible side to him. But he was sort of telling us again, about how he'd been sort of hidden in a secret compartment, underneath the pigs. And then when he was eventually released, he was badly crippled from having spent too long sort of in that place. And when he was under there, his mum gave him sort of him and his brother, sort of a pen and paper, and he'd draw from memory, these sort of, the scenes of normal domesticity in his normal life, and the drawings are actually in the Yad Vashem, which is the big Jerusalem Holocaust museum. And that the Holocaust survivors, because it was a project for the love of it, I didn't have an assistant, I didn't have there was no kind of formal kind of process. I just sort of turned up, and some people wanted to talk, some people didn't want to talk.
Yeah, well, there's
lots of cups of tea were drunk, and
it was. I tell you, the one. There's another beautiful portrait, Meyer Breitberg, in your book, and he said, "I have nothing to say," but he had everything to say, because the way you've constructed the photograph, there are pictures on the wall of his family, and I guess ones that didn't survive, and the kind of. The loneliness of him sitting on that sofa is a really emotional photograph. What did you talk about with him?
I do remember him saying, that he was trying to explain to me that he didn't have anything to. He didn't want to write anything, and I just said, "Well, just write. I have nothing to say." If that's what you've, I didn't coach him, but I think. What I tend to do, I remember, with that picture, sometimes the pictures just present themselves to you, and you kind of, what happened with the evolution of my kind of approach was that initially I sort of tried to master, lighting and sort of, I was into more Irving Penn and the exquisite way that the composition works. And then over the course of my career, I was lucky enough to get a couple of World Press Awards, and I kind of and I got asked to join IPG, which is an agency that had a lot of really great documentary photographers like Tom Stoddart, and Derek Hudson and Richard Baker and Peter Dench, and I kind of got influenced by sort of the environment more, and I began to realise it's a bit like with film, you know, it's so easy to sort of take a simple, well-lit sort of Irving Penn type of portrait, and whereas it's much more interesting to kind of take an environmental portrait.
Yeah, because all those pictures in Survivor, I guess, was a challenge because you didn't know what to expect.
Yeah, they're all environmental portraits.
Yes.
Mostly.
Yes.
I mean, sometimes I did go in close, but to me it's a cheap trick, really. It's very easy, especially with digital SLRs. Everything appears super sharp.
Yes,
you know, anyone can do it. Whereas none of those pictures are cropped. They're all cropped in the camera. So the actual format of a 35mm SLR sort of dictates the layout of the book.
Yes.
And so so that's why there's a consistency in terms of the sharpness, and they're all the same, pretty much the same ASA and the same f-stop, and I just vary the shutter speed by putting the camera on the tripod. So there's a consistency, and that's what I was attempting, is just to have that consistency of vision, you know.
Right.
And so I see that I instinctively crop the pictures in the camera. So I laid out the book myself, and I entered it in the European Publishing Award for Photography in 2014, and it was shortlisted. But it wasn't like I did think about getting a designer involved, but I just laid it. The pages just laid themselves out with the text and everything. So
was there any particular reason? I noticed looking through the book, lots of the people are looking away from camera or looking up. Was there any particular reason why you shot them in that way?
The sort of reflective nature of the handwriting and the intimacy, and the way that people kind of were thinking about what they were going to write, kind of lent itself to maybe me preferring those particular images to pictures that were where they were more confrontational. I mean, the one where he says, "I have nothing to say," you know, that works quite well with him looking into the camera.
Yes.
Whereas if somebody's, or there's another one, as somebody said, remember children and babies were murdered. Yes. You know, that confrontation, that worked very well with looking straight to the camera. Yeah. But then, you know, some it depended on what the written words were.
And there's the other glorious. It is a glorious photograph. It's Felix Fibich, the dancer.
Yeah, that's my favourite picture, actually, in the set. Yeah,
that goes into a different realm.
Yeah, well,
it goes into something about humanity that is because he'd been a dancer, and there's that lovely picture of him as a dancer, full of the joie de vivre and the and the looseness to the picture of him. That's also something I'm quite interested in exploring. I've got this. I don't know if you've seen I've done this other series of portraits of farmers. Yes.
Yeah. So it's quite, for me, as somebody who's, you know, middle-aged, you know, and suddenly aware of the kind of finality of life. You know, I just think it's so poignant, and that's what you were kind of referring to in that picture, when you see somebody at the end of their life and he's dead. He died sadly. I mean, and there was an obituary about him in the New York Times. So it was obviously, there's YouTube videos of him. I mean, he's an extraordinary character. You should just do a search. Yeah. It's so sort of poignant. When he was just such a lovely man as well. You know, we were in his flat when he was with his carer, and he sort of said to me, can I just, rather than me pose, can I just express myself through dance? And he just started doing all these shapes and everything, and I was just kind of absolutely, you know, the most amazing face anyway. Yes. But yeah, it's almost too difficult to look at because it's so kind of emotional. Yeah.
How did working on the book change your aspect on life and who you are as a person?
Well, just, you know, I went to Arles about 10 years ago, and I think it was when Vanessa Winship did her series of portraits of, I don't know if you're familiar with it. I think she won this. She did the whole series of portraits of young girls, and I think they were in Eastern Europe, and they were a really nice series. And I'd known Vanessa because she'd been part of IPG, and she's a very talented photographer, and I just remember sort of seeing the series at Arles, and then looking at all these other photographers who, you know, they were really great photographers, people that I knew professionally. I'd sort of seen, they were getting commissions and stuff, but they had all these personal projects. And I think I was just sort of getting to the point where, I mean, it's very seductive to carry on, because especially if you photograph celebrities and you get commissions, and I still get commissions, so I've been very lucky in that respect. You're at a dinner party and everyone's interested to know what David Beckham's like, or what was Zara Phillips like, or whatever, or and so on. But ultimately, it's pretty of very little consequence. It's pretty facile and ephemeral, really. And so really I just thought, I think I want to, in parallel really, I'm not going to stop doing these celebrities, because I do think that they sort of tell us about the times we live in, and occasionally you get quite an interesting picture, like the Michael Hutchence picture, which is sort of carried on being of interest. People in Australia were, just loving that picture. And sometimes you'll take a picture of, say, for instance, the Spice Girls. Like, it's been 20 years since I photographed the Spice Girls, and now those pictures are, at the time, they were being syndicated all over the place, and then people weren't interested in the Spice Girls, and they were really naff. And my agent sort of said, "Take that picture of the Spice Girls out of your portfolio," And in spite of the fact that the pictures in the National Portrait Gallery, I've got 2 pictures of the Spice Girls in the NPG, in the archive. And so they became naff, and then now they're sort of like, people look back on them with nostalgia, and I do think in another 20 years' time, the people look at the 90s in the way that people look at Gerard Menkowitz's pictures of Jimi Hendrix in the 60s. Yeah. And whilst I'm not in any way equating the Spice Girls with a genius like Jimi Hendrix, you know what I mean. Yes. Maybe that tells us more about the fact that the quality of the music that existed in the 60s as opposed to the 90s. But they tell us about the times we live in. So I wouldn't ever kind of draw a veil over those pictures. And as I say, I did approach them with a certain amount of integrity. Richard Harris, people that are kind of were quite amazing.
The Richard Harris side, because he was well. I mean, was he within a year or so before he died, I guess?
Yeah. He was kind of.
What was he like? What was Richard Harris like?
It was brilliant. I mean, he basically was living at the Savoy at the time, and was very kind of obstreperous and difficult, and he refused to do a formal photo session, and it was for Empire, and the magazine, basically the writer sort of was doing the interview, and he said, you can take pictures while the interview's in the progress. And I kind of thought, that's no good at all. But so I put my Hasselblad on the tripod and put 400 ASA in, and then used a 120 sort of longish lens, and I got that picture that's which is actually better than. He warmed to us, and after a while he was telling us all these amazing stories about how useless Bruce Willis was, and all these kind of modern day Hollywood icons were just like nothing compared to him, and Richard Burton and people like that. It was amazing day. And then afterwards he sort of suggested we all go for. He was really liking us, and he gave me a full session. But it's funny because I like that picture actually more than any of the subsequent pictures I took. And then we ended up going on a pub crawl down the Strand, to various. Yeah. And then in the afternoon, back then I was doing so many jobs. I had a cover of BBC Music, which I had to shoot in Highgate Cemetery, and so I had to get my assistant to drive us in the car because I sort of had too many beers. I'm not a drinker really, so I was complete lightweight, And so I arrived on that shoot, and there's a big production there and everything. And I often think they probably thought, well, he's a good photographer, but he's got a bit of a drink problem, turning up, But I thought you don't turn down the chance of going drinking. But in answer to your question, I mean, I think doing the book. It has the chance of standing the test of time and being kind of, there's this sort of, when you do, it's like eating sweets doing the celebrities, it's obviously, you're not going to turn down meeting, last time I was in Cardiff, actually, it was about a month ago, I was doing Peter Capaldi for Doctor Who.
With the shut eyes.
With Francesca actually assisting me. And, it's fun, My kids are into Doctor Who. It's fun if you get his autograph, and he's a really nice man. But ultimately, you know, it's sort of it's a bit, as I've said this before, I think it's like, you know, you're like a cork, sort of just floating around, you know, being kind of it's quite fun because you don't know what you're going to be doing next week, and it's not to everyone's. Not anyone can. I think it's a bit like being. I think it's a lot like being a professional sports person, in a sense that you have long periods of inactivity, and then you have this sort of moment like 15 minutes or maybe an hour when you have to be creative on demand, and you have to sort of express yourself and be really, really on it, and then you've got this, and then you've got these long periods of inactivity. And I think like a lot of people can't cope with that, but I'm quite well suited to that. That's why, you know, I play snooker and stuff.
Yeah,
well, I like playing sport. I like that pressure, you know, to express yourself.
Yeah, I think probably the first photographer we've met who's actually got his snooker kit with him in Cardiff. But it's good, but it's about angle, isn't it?
Well, it's the angle of incidence equals angle of reflection.
Yeah.
No, I mean, it's, you know, I'd be uneasy about drawing comparisons with my snooker. But I do think, you know, there's a level of focus and, you know, getting into the, you know, basically, you know, when you're doing these shoots, you know, you're like you're waiting for your opportunity, you know, and then suddenly effectively your opponent sort of misses, and then you've got to take your opportunity. And quite often it is like that, you know, with, say, Baroness Thatcher, you know, thanks to the metadata, you know, I know that I only had 12 minutes from the first frame until the end of the shoot. So, and that's for, you know, a big shoot for Time magazine. Yeah. And so you have, I mean, it's a lot easier with digital cameras because you know you've got it. But
we were talking to a photographer the other day who photographed Baroness Thatcher, but she was Prime Minister when he photographed her, and he had to wait, and he took some frames just to test in her office. And her handbag happened to be on the desk of the office, and the handbag made it with Paris Match and, you know, various other syndicated around the world. But it was a loose shot that he took. I mean, the shots he has of Thatcher are really good, but you know, the handbag was the one.
Yeah, well, I did that actually because I say 12 minutes while she was getting ready. She was actually very nice, and I despise you know, everything she stands for, but on a human level, she was very, you know, she was actually quite a nice person, and it was quite strange seeing this person that, you know, the Iron Lady, sort of enfeebled by human frailty. Yeah. It was a very strange experience because she'd sort of loomed so large. But I did in the lead up to my official shoot, you know, she was getting ready, and I put a little ring flash on the camera, and I took some pictures beforehand, and one of them was her hands rest in her lap on top of her handbag, which was made for quite a good image.
Why did you pick the one with the eyes shut?
I personally I like that picture because it's sort of like a death mask, and it sort of has it just stood out. But it's quite a comprehensive. I don't know if you've seen the shoot because it's...
No, I have not, no.
If you do a search on my website, there's quite a few good pictures from that set, and Time didn't use that picture. It wasn't used at the time. And then subsequently, I think I entered it in the Press Photographer's Year, and it won a prize for the best portrait. Or I think it got a prize in the... I think it did quite well. It got into the Royal Photographic Society. It won a bronze prize or silver prize, and then she asked or her people asked if they could use it on her foundation website, and I thought, you know, why not?
Why not? Yeah, indeed. Have you been tempted to go into the sort of landscape world?
No, I photograph everything. I mean, you know, right, so yeah. I mean, on my Instagram feed, I kind of, you know, I just enjoy the whole process. Really, kind of, it's lovely that people are so enthused by the medium, so it's much more kind of...
And the iPhone, of course.
Absolutely, it's a brilliant camera, yeah.
Yeah.
So I do think there's something sort of kind of pitiable in the kind of fetishization of the landscape, in the sense of the way it used to be with film, and, you know, these people sort of, you know, going up self-flagellatingly, going up mountains and sort of like camping and seeing, you know, and it's kind of like it's a bit macho and a bit nerdy, kind of a bit, you know, I was there and everything. And ultimately, a lot of landscapes for me fail in the test of, you know, what are you trying to say?
Yes.
If all you're saying is, you know, I got up really early and, you know, I can totally understand, and it's good if people get into photography that way, and I did. I used to sort of try and take these pictures of the sunsets and so on, but I just think you've always, in a world that's full of those sorts of pictures, you've got to ask, what are you saying?
Indeed.
And if you're not saying anything intelligent, if you're just saying, isn't this a pretty picture? Well, the world's full of those sorts of pictures, unless it's an extraordinarily kind of different picture or an incredible kind of unique serendipitous moment where everything comes in, it's absolutely perfect. I mean, whenever I do take landscapes, I always invariably think they're better if there's some kind of thing for your eye to end up going onto. I took a picture about a year ago. In fact, when I was on my way to playing snooker with my iPhone in the middle of Taunton, and there's a swan in the middle of on the River Tone, and it's just it's just a nice little spot. I noticed it got a lot of likes anyway, but I do think sort of they're a bit banal because basically you can if you go to you just buy the postcard, why it's a waste of your resources, those pictures are kind of, and also quite often those pictures are kind of they're photographing something that won't look any different in 1,000 years.
Yes. To latch back to the survivors and the pictures on the wall and how powerful those pictures are, what kind of worries me in this digital age is that we don't actually print much stuff. How much do you print? Do you print an awful lot of your material? Or
probably not as much as I should. I mean, I've got a printer an expensive printer that sort of basically the inks cost as much as the price of a printer, and that it's currently run out of ink, and I haven't. It says a lot that I haven't replaced the ink, but no, I do like to print off things, and I certainly. Make a point of, say, for instance, you've probably seen the pictures I did of single-parent fathers.
Yes, indeed.
So,
and the lovely music on the video as well.
Yeah, I just put that together, but basically, everybody in the, I photographed, obviously, it's very precious for them to have a photograph of their family. And in fact, that project, I photographed Bob Geldof, and I sort of told him about the project, and then after the shoot, it was for the Guardian weekend, I realised that I'd photographed his daughter who died, and I hadn't realised that I'd even photographed her when I was shooting him, and she'd been really nice and so on, and I just thought about how I would feel. And so I just sent off all the digital files from the whole shoot. I didn't edit them down or anything, and made snappy snaps, and then just posted them off to his agent, and then he emailed me and said, really thanking me, and then talking about the single parent dads project. But in the email it was so touching because he just said, people don't realise that's all I have, things like this. And so he asked if he could do anything. So I said, it'd be great if you could write an essay on fatherhood. And he wrote me this amazing essay that when I publish that as a book, it will make an amazing kind of prelude to the piece, because I didn't realise it, but he was brought up by a single parent dad. As well as being an advocate for fathers and so on, he was a single parent. So his father was a single parent dad, and he obviously was had a tough time with him at times, but he really respected him.
So what's the next project?
Well, that single parent dads, the farmers. I've got lots of projects actually. There's another one that I want to do that is. I don't know whether. I mean, it'll be different for whoever did it, but I just think the sort of a whole social media thing is completely fake, and it's very rare that I sort of after a session of looking at Facebook that I feel better about myself or even good about myself. I sort of feel it's like a colossal waste of time. I've got these thousands of people that are kind of like ersatz friends that I don't even know who they are. I just find it discombobulating just looking at these people that are supposedly my friends. And so as an antidote to that, what I quite like to do, which I realised is possible now through, ironically, Facebook, is that everybody that has meant something to me, every woman I've slept with or every friend that I've ever had, I'd like to sort of photograph them all the same way, on a medium format camera, 6.9 rangefinder, and then basically sort of have them as diptychs in contrast with a picture of them when they meant something to me. So that and I realised there was one girlfriend that had been quite a difficult breakup, and she'd thrown a chair through a window, and it'd been kind of like, she didn't. That was sort of my first real relationship, and it was a bit of a kind of difficult breakup. And the other day I was just on Facebook, and how Facebook's algorithms sort of suggest people you might know, because I still knew her sister, so I just clicked add friend, because I thought it's been 30 years. And then she accepted my friend's request. And then when my book came out, the Survivor book, she wrote a really lovely comment, and she said I just wanted to say I'm really proud to have known you. And she was the only person that that I haven't slept with a lot of women that I did would have felt a bit strange getting in contact with. So I do think that would be an interesting, just as a comment on the kind of fake nature of relationships, and the fact that we've evolved to live in communities that are very small and have probably like 6 friends, but have proper relationships with those friends, so you can say, actually, I'm depressed, I'm not happy, or something really bad's happened, rather than the bullshit that you get on Facebook with people self-marketing, sort of showing people their stuff in order to kind of show off to people they don't even care about.
Yeah. Your Farmers Project, what's really interesting about that one is how did they behave towards you when you went back to rephotograph them?
Well,
or was it just...
It's just the same as it was before. They're my mates. So I think apropos of what we were just saying about the Facebook thing, and a good barometer of whether I'm suspicious of people who kind of suddenly reinvent themselves, and that they're not friends with people that Howell will always be my friend, yes. And I met him when I was sort of 18, but these people there's a picture, and you might have seen it. There's a picture of primary school.
Yeah.
I've known these people
yes,
since
with the arrows and stuff on it. Yeah.
Yeah. So we all had our nicknames. There was Balty, Batty. My name was Oggy, I guess, because my dad was a pig farmer. Fuzzy, Binny. We had all these nicknames and everything. And so when we see, I was in Australia. When I was in Australia, I was staying with my friend in Perth, and I was telling him when I was sort of seeing this guy Binny, and I was sort of, he's like proper, he's Robin Arthur was as the first one with his daughter, and I sort of was saying, and he said, "Oh, do you still see Leper?" Because this guy in Australia his nickname was Leper, his name was Matthew Strong, but I mean, they're they were my friends, and as I say, I worked on my dad's farm, so I was like, no, I was exactly the same as them, really, and I did that project, as I said, to sharpen my skills, I guess, and use a new camera. I'd got this Fuji 6.7 actually, rangefinder camera.
Beautiful things, yeah.
So I took these pictures, and then they just lay dormant. I didn't do anything with them, and then I realised it was 20 years since I'd photographed them, and I thought that's quite interesting. And I love those pictures by that photographer Nick. I forget his surname, but he did his wife and her sisters. And there's also a similar series by Zed Nelson.
Zed Nelson, yes.
With that family.
Yeah.
And but I think what's interesting when you look at those pictures is sort of, the contrast. You don't need to look at sort of one took every year. You just need the kind of cutting to the chase.
Yes.
So, in another sort of 17 years, I'll photograph them again. Hopefully they'll all be around. And that will really be something, I think. Because when I went back there, you've seen them, I got a photograph of them that was taken 20 years before from their family album. So it's like 10 farmers, 10 lives,
The other picture that struck me from your Survivor book was Lydia Vargo and the painting.
Yeah. She's an extraordinary woman, because when we went, my daughter and I went back to Israel, like I said, and we stayed with Jack Jaggett, and we had a little event, and she came, and she's such an amazing woman, she's such a vibe, such a lot of energy and everything, and I was kind of really pleased to see that she was still around, because she was pretty old when I photographed her. But I remember her flat really well. I mean, some shoots generally, not just these survivors, you tend to forget them, and then other ones are sort of seared on your memory, and she's one of those. Because it was so courageous of her to let us photograph her, because she was actually sort of, I think she probably had a bit of a problem like throwing stuff away, so her flat was just full of stuff, like the other rooms it was just piling high. And yet, you know, she was kind of let us in, and, you know, she's obviously a very creative person as well, because the poem she wrote is very moving.
It is very moving. And
that's one of my favourite pictures, that one. Yeah.
How did you find the people, Harry?
What I did was I kind of leveraged my celebrity portraits. So initially, I went and gave a talk at the London Jewish Cultural Centre. They have a sort of an operation where, I mean, I don't think they exist in the form that they did 10 years ago, but they have a sort of it's for people in the community to come in, and you know, they're members, and they get interesting people to come in and give a talk. And so I just offered to come and give a talk about my photography. So I sort of talked about, you know, photographing celebrities, and then at the end of the talk I said, you know, I'm interested in doing portraits of survivors. You know, I said, you know, this project, you know, I'm not a tourist, you know, I'm interested in exploring a part of my identity, because my dad's, you know, I'm half Jewish, I guess, and know nothing about being Jewish, or never met any Jewish people really. And you know, I sort of said anyone interested would get a free print, you know. And as I said previously, I think a lot of people were kind of like impressed that they could be photographed by the same photographer who'd photographed Baroness Thatcher or whatever. And then once I had a little collection of portraits, and I sort of instinctively I don't know where I got the idea of getting them to write something. I just thought it would further personalise the pictures. But once I had a few sort of laid out, I put them on my website, and then I sort of did an interview over the phone with the Australian Jewish News, and said, look, I'm coming to Australia. This was around 2008, Christmas 2008. You know, would anyone be interested in being part of this project? Which was nice, because the Australian Jewish News interviewed me when I was over in Melbourne, you know, sort of 10 years later. And I was able to sort of say, look, thanks for helping me. So I used that, again, you know, sort of they were interested in the fact that I'd photographed celebrities as well. And then it sort of built momentum. And then when I got back, a woman called Miriam Hechtman, who is became really great friend, you know, and when I was over there, you know, basically what happened was she got in contact and asked if she could get involved in some way. And she's the granddaughter of survivors, and, you know, was married to an Israeli, you know, and knew a bit of Hebrew and stuff like that. So it was like the perfect person to come along, you know, and help me, because I think, you know, quite often as photographers we're kind of have a temptation, you know, it's like with my project with the Facebook thing, you know, the reason I just told you is because I can't stand photographers who go, I'm working on something but I can't tell you, because it's like, you know, no one gives a shit, you know, you know, if someone else wants to do that, it's not going to be done the same way as I would do it, and it's sort of like, it's just an idea, you know, I might not even do it. So I just thought, you know, in for a penny, in for a pound. You know, I don't know anything about Miriam. So we sort of we spoke on Skype, and then she arranged to meet in Israel. She was from Australia. She'd seen the article in the Australian Jewish News, but it'd been too late. Mm-hmm. And so we arranged, and then in the intervening time, my now ex sort of announced that she wanted to split, you know, and so I thought, you know, it was like my world falling apart. And I phoned up Miriam, and I said, look, I'm really sorry to mess you around, but, you know, and then I sort of had time to reflect, and I just thought, actually, that's not fair on her, and actually it might be a really good thing to do. It might be a really healing. Might be good to just get away from the UK and just sort of, you know, get out of my routine and get, you know, allow the dust to settle in my kind of emotional life. And it turned out to be a brilliant thing, because I spent sort of almost 2 weeks driving around Israel with Miriam. You know, I kind of probably fell a bit in love with her. You know, it was kind of like a really healing thing. You know, we were just chatting the whole time, and we were just on this joint venture, you know, and she kind of, I needed it to be to have the breadth. I needed it to be a global thing. I didn't want it to be a little parochial thing. And so then after that, I met Abby, and then Abby got pregnant, and then Miriam got pregnant. So our children are the same age. and while Miriam was pregnant, we went to New York, which was the final trip. And, that's when I was staying with Al Ben Susan, the old chap.
What makes you such a grounded person? I'm intrigued.
I'm just putting in an act. I'm not really. I don't know. I mean, I think I'm quite. I think it's probably actually getting back to what we were talking about at the beginning. I do think if you have the edges knocked off you, if you have, it's a combination of. I'm not in any way endorsing your view of me, immodestly, but I do think as an abstract idea, I do think, the sum total of your experiences, and, my experiences on the whole have been really positive, so I think for the world of photography is quite fair, it's tough at the moment, but I mean, if you do, like, I watched a talk with Martin Parr, and somebody in the front row was saying at the questions session at the end, oh, it's just terrible, how do you get anything published? And he says it's simple, just take some amazing pictures. And if you do something really amazing, like Juno Calypso, with her pictures, say for instance, you can get a lot of exposure and a lot of traction very, very quickly. If you can do something that hasn't been seen before. And that's been my experience with the Survivor book. I wasn't sort of I didn't set out to do strategically to sort of. I just did it for the right reasons, and because it would be an interesting path to wander down. And
it's all about honesty and
I
guess.
Yeah, I mean, I just try and I think you've ultimately got to try and be true to yourself, know. And I always say to people, just do things for the right reasons. And then even if you don't fail according to sort of arbitrary ideas of failure and success, you'll have had an enjoyable life. The worst thing is to sort of like try and sort of give people what they want or kind of box tick, and then you fail and you've it's been stressful and not really particularly enjoyable. So I mean, I do think if you're clear about your motivation and it's evolved. I've evolved. You should be getting somewhere by the time you got to my age. Otherwise, in terms of your emotional development.
Yes.
Because if you keep doing the same things, expecting the outcome to be different each time, it's the definition of insanity, isn't it? So you learn from your mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
You kind of finesse your way through. You evolve. And I've sort of evolved a kind of an approach which I'm quite evangelical about, which is, as I said, it's encapsulated by this book that I read by Oliver James called Affluenza. Most people in the West, we kind of like sell our lives down the river, to earn a monthly paycheck. So we're doing stuff we don't enjoy in order to get a paycheck at the end of the month. And what he advocates and what happens in sort of so-called less kind of advanced societies is people just do stuff for the intrinsic pleasure of doing it. And then they, that's a much kind of richer and more rewarding way to approach life, I think.